Kevin spent the night in Officer Emmett's living room as he recovered from his injuries from the bank robbery. The next day he went to his office and saw that Williams Media was still losing money. Things finally turned around after Tyler threw KWTD's support behind him. Kevin left Cook and the others to keep an eye on things in his office while he headed over to see Phoebe. "Is this what you were looking for?" Phoebe asked. He picked up one of the books and started to thumb through it. "Yes, thanks," he replied absently as he looked at the photos and drawings. "A lot of the stones are simply decorative," Phoebe Anderson explained, "but there are some people who swear that certain stones can help with different physical or mental ailments. What exactly are you researching?" "Nothing in particular, just a sudden interest," Kevin replied casually. Phoebe nodded in understanding. After a long pause, Phoebe looked at Kevin, who was lost in the book, and lightly bit her lower lip as she said, "I hope you're still not upset about what my father said the other day. Please don't take it to heart. He has a pretty bad temper, especially when family is involved." When she finished speaking, she couldn't look Kevin in the eye. It had been a pretty strange and embarrassing scene. She really couldn't blame her father for getting upset even though he was mad at the wrong person. "That's okay, Phoebe. It's understandable," Kevin said casually. Suddenly, Kevin put down the old book in his hand. After hesitating for a moment, he looked at Phoebe and asked, "After we left your home, did your dad say anything?" "What do you mean?" Phoebe asked a little tentatively. She really didn't want to tell Kevin about the awkward conversation she had had with her father after Kevin, Lily, and Rachel left. "No, nothing special," Phoebe stammered. "I explained everything to him as clearly as I could and I think he felt bitter." "Oh, what did you tell him?" Kevin asked with great interest. Of course I told him the truth," Phoebe said quietly. Phoebe didn't know why she was having so much trouble talking about it. "That's a relief," Kevin said. "Thank you for letting me borrow these books." Then Kevin picked up the old guides and started to head for the door. Phoebe suddenly asked, "How about if I walk you downstairs?" Kevin gave her a quizzical look. "Why are you still standing there? Come on, let's go," Phoebe said as she gestured for Kevin to walk with her toward the large staircase. As Kevin and Phoebe walked through the main showroom to the front door, the customers and employees watched them with interest, wondering what they could have been meeting about. When Kevin got back to Corwin Tower, Lily wasn't home yet. Kevin didn't think much about this and went straight into the study. He took out the bracelet and compared it with the illustrations in the book that he'd borrowed from Phoebe. Finally, he found what he was looking for. While he'd been focusing on herbal medications which could often have the same effects and benefits as modern medicine, certain stones and crystals were claimed to help increase those effects. The information in the books was pretty old, but Kevin couldn't deny that he had felt a lot more focused while holding the bracelet. According to one of the books, this was probably from the tourmaline stone which he and everyone else had originally mistaken for an emerald. He was still kicking himself over that gaffe. The next 5 days seemed to pass in the blink of an eye. During this time, Kevin went to his office at Williams Media every day. In the evenings, he would return to his penthouse at Corwin Tower and prepare dinner for Lily. After that, the two of them would take a leisurely walk around the neighborhood or in the park. Under the seemingly calm surface, the relationship between Kevin and Lily was quickly warming up. Finally, the huge economic turmoil that had been stirred up by the Williams family ended on the 8th day. It was obvious that, although the Williams family had gathered a lot of forces to help them, faced with the backing that Kevin had gotten from Tyler and the Orion Group, their attempt was doomed to fail. "I'm glad it's finally over," Mitchell Cook said as he let out a heavy sigh. "That really wasn't easy," Adriana said as she rubbed her eyes. "That's an understatement," Emos said wearily. "Even though we won, we had some pretty heavy losses." It had been an expensive battle for both sides. In the end, there weren't many casualties, but the total funds that the William family and Kevin's associate had poured into the fight exceeded $30 billion. The fight hadn't been without its risks. If any of them had made the slightest mistake, they would have been eaten alive by their competitors. They'd originally planned to sink $120 million into taking us down, even though it meant sacrificing themselves, Kevin said as he put down his coffee cup. There was no joy on his face. Instead, he looked a little wistful. "Mitch, Now we can put our plan into action. Kevin, what plan do you and Mitch have in mind? Adriana asked with a puzzled look on her face. We've been planning this for a while, Cook explained. We're going to open the largest hotel in Chicago and at the same time take over the city's catering industry. That's a fantastic idea. Kevin, is there anything you need our help with? Adriana volunteered. Not yet, thanks. We'll be happy to join forces with you later, but we've all suffered a lot lately. You, Emo, and Gilbert should take some time to help your companies recover, Kevin said thoughtfully. Adriana and the others nodded in agreement when they heard him say this. A few Chicago companies hadn't survived the financial battle that had just ripped through the local economy. 3 days later, the whole city of Chicago was buzzing with the latest news. The Salix Leaf Hotel broke ground with much fanfare. The ceremony was attended by Mitchell Cook, the owner of the Whistler Hotel, Adriana Wright, the president of the West Chicago International Group, Gilbert Rhodes, the owner of the Chartreuse Mill Bar, Emo Squire, a leader in the private security industry, and Sandra Wilson, the chief of staff at Williams Media. Everyone in Chicago knew that these people had helped the city to survive the recent economic crisis. Even though no one knew who the CEO of Salix Leaf Hotel was, judging from the distinguished attendees, they knew that it was someone very powerful. The highest-ranking dignitaries and government officials were also there to congratulate them. The most excited attendee was the new vice president and general manager of the Salix Leaf Hotel, Rachel Butcher, who had decided to go by her maiden name, Rachel Collins. It seemed that the local media outlets were interviewing her constantly. The entire complex was planned to take up over 10 city blocks. Over the next 2 years, the corporation would build luxury hotels and apartments for a cost of at least $3 billion. Within a day, the Willow Leaf Corporation became a household name, and Rachel's net worth skyrocketed too. She was suddenly one of the most influential people in Chicago, and she was attracting the attention of a lot of movers and shakers. That night, after Lily called Kevin, she returned home with Rachel. "Oh, Rachel is here. Quick, sit down so we can talk." Dorothy greeted her warmly. "I really never expected you to be the vice president of the new hotel. If you make any connections, don't forget to include Lily." "Don't flatter me, Dorothy. I'm really just working for someone else," Rachel said modestly. "That's okay," Dorothy said happily. Just then Lily touched Rachel on the shoulder. "Tell me honestly, how did you get to know someone so important?" Lily was well aware of Rachel's family background. It must have been difficult for her to suddenly be dealing with all these rich and powerful people like Mitchell Cook. "What important person? It's just that the CEO thinks highly of me." Rachel struggled to explain as a look of panic flashed across her eyes. Without Kevin's permission, Rachel could never reveal his identity. "Oh, really? When will you introduce me to your boss?" Lily teased. No problem. I'll introduce you to him as soon as I have the time," Rachel said with an awkward smile. Kevin slowly pushed the door open and entered the room. Rachel began to stand up when she saw him, but was stopped when he shot her a quick look that reminded her to not let on that he was her boss. "You're back already?" Lily asked with a smile. "Yes." Kevin nodded and looked around the room. "When did Rachel get here? You guys keep chatting. I'm a little tired, so I think I'll go upstairs to rest." Rachel breathed a sigh of relief that she hadn't revealed Kevin's secret. But she didn't know how much longer she could keep it up. The evening after the groundbreaking for the Salix Leaf Hotel, Lily and Rachel went home and spent some time chatting with Dorothy. Rachel was excited to be the vice president of Kevin's new company, but it was awkward to talk about her job without mentioning Kevin. When he came in, she got even more nervous and couldn't relax until he finally went upstairs. But Dorothy was unhappy that Kevin hadn't been a better host and complained to Lily. "Did you see that? Rachel came to visit and he didn't even bother to offer her something, not even a piece of fruit." "Oh, Dorothy, it's no big deal. I'm not even hungry," Rachel replied pleasantly. But Dorothy's attitude was very distressing for her because of how grateful she was to Kevin for her new job. Dorothy wanted Kevin to wash fruit for her? If only she knew how powerful he really was. Then I'll go get you something to drink. How about some water? Dorothy said very enthusiastically. Now that Rachel had moved up the corporate ladder, Dorothy naturally wanted to get in her good graces. Meanwhile, Kevin was lying on the bed using his phone to surf for more information on healing stones that might increase the effectiveness of his herbal medicine. Suddenly, Lily opened the door and asked him expectantly, "Kevin, there's an event we've been invited to the day after tomorrow. Do you want to go?" "What event?" Kevin asked curiously. "The Jones family lost a lot during that whole mess caused by the Williams family. So the Blair family is getting together more than a dozen wealthy families to invest in a huge high-end real estate development," Lily explained. "Are you sure you want me to go along?" Kevin asked in confusion. He didn't like to have anything to do with these people, but not because he didn't like to socialize. It was just that they ran in different circles. "Now that I have 60% of the Jones Company shares, I'm going to represent the family. Since you're my husband, it's only right that you should be there too," Lily told him. "Come on, we've never gone camping like this," Lily pleaded. "How could I say no? When do we head up there?" Kevin asked enthusiastically. "Tomorrow," Lily started to say, then she looked at the clothes Kevin was wearing and said, Do you think you could change your clothes? Now that you have a good job, I'm sure you could afford to get something nicer. There's no reason for you to go around dressed in rags." "But isn't it just a camping trip?" "You really want me to get new clothes to go camping?" Kevin protested. Lily sighed and replied, "Yup. Anyway, you won't have anything to do but be my arm candy. After all, it's my business trip." "All right. I guess I can pretend I'm your gopher. I can get you sparkling water, carry your bags, things like that," Kevin joked as he put down his phone. "Don't tell me you want people to go back to calling you a freeloader." But just as she said this, Lily caught herself. "I'm sorry, Kevin, I shouldn't have said that." "That's okay. Anyway, you're my wife. You can say whatever you want to me," Kevin said casually. It didn't hurt his feelings at all. "Then let's go right now," Lily said excitedly as she smiled and took Kevin's hand. So they headed out to go shopping together. The problem was, Kevin just wasn't used to wearing fancy clothes. He preferred casual wear. Not only was it cheaper, but it was also a lot more comfortable. Finally, after making Lily roll her eyes in frustration at least a dozen times, Kevin had no choice but to give in. He ended up buying 2 short-sleeve shirts, some pants, and 3 jackets. When he got to the register, the associate scanned the items, then smugly looked Kevin up and down before saying, "The total is $1,832. Cash or credit?" Kevin took a deep breath and reluctantly said, "Credit." "Wait a minute," Lily suddenly said as she grabbed Kevin's hand. "We've been married for how long? And I've never bought you anything. This is on me." When he heard this, Kevin smiled broadly and said, "If you insist." The next morning, as the sun was starting to rise over Lake Michigan, the Blair family sent a car to pick up Lily and Kevin at Corwin Tower. After about 2 hours, the caravan of over a dozen limousines stopped at their destination up near Rockford. "So this is where you plan to build?" Kevin whispered to Lily as they got out of the limo. "Yes, isn't it beautiful? It cost a little over $200 million for the land. Then each family is going to spend another $45 million for the construction costs," Lily replied with a smile. Kevin shook his head when he heard her say this. He didn't think that it was a good place for a luxury housing development. There was a river nearby which was picturesque, but he wondered if anyone had even looked into the chance of flooding. As Kevin was thinking about this, he heard a familiar, annoying voice. "Kevin, what are you doing here? Did Lily finally let you out of the house?" Jason said with disdain. Lily had more status in the Jones family, but Jason still looked down on Kevin. Of course, this brought on whispering from the other guests. They were wondering if Kevin was the worthless freeloader Jason had been talking about. "Isn't that obvious? He must have tagged along with his wife to get free food and drinks," Jason sneered. "Otherwise, he could never afford to take part in a high-end camping trip like this." They all burst into laughter. Kevin glared at Jason but didn't say anything. It was better to ignore him. However, this teasing made Lily very unhappy. "Jason, what do you mean by that? We all came out here to have fun. If you pick another fight with Kevin, Don't blame me for what happens to you. Lily's right, Jason, you really talk too much, Matilda reminded him. As she said this, she gave Kevin a little nod. Jason just grumbled and walked away. By now, a lot of them had already started to set up their tents. Of course, some of them wouldn't lower themselves to do manual labor, so they just sat in the shade on lawn chairs and watched. Most of the people on the camping trip were young. They were the future of the various companies involved in the business venture, and what they were interested in most of all was networking. But they were all distracted by the sight of Lily and Matilda Jones when they changed into their camping outfits. They were the most attractive women there. Suddenly a man walked up to Lily and said, "Hi, Miss Jones, my name is Doug Butler. I've been hearing about you for a long time and I'm so glad to finally meet you." When he heard the man say his name, Kevin did a spit take and couldn't help laughing. "What's your name?" "Doug Butt. Who gave you a name like that?" "What are you laughing at, you bum?" Butler growled. Nothing, Kevin said as he casually waved his hand, but he still couldn't hold back his laughter. "What the hell? Why are you still laughing at me?" he shouted again. "Tell me, what the hell is so funny?" "I just think your name's a little funny," Kevin said with a smile. When they heard Kevin say this, everyone started to mutter Doug Butler's name. Pretty soon, everyone in the group started laughing. Butler rolled up his sleeves and snarled, "How about if I wipe that smile off your face?" Just as Butler was about to attack Kevin, Lily stepped between the two men and said, "Mr. Butler, please, don't be angry. We're all here to enjoy ourselves. Let's just relax and have a good time." Butler looked at Lily and calmed down a little. Then he turned to Kevin and warned him, "As a favor to your wife, I'll let you off this time, but if you do it again, I'll break your friggin' legs." Kevin just gave him a blank stare. He didn't want to upset Lily, but he clearly remembered that when Jason mocked him earlier, Butler had also joined in, and he had been the one who laughed the loudest. Now that the guy was hitting on Lily, Kevin wasn't going to give him a pass. Right at that moment, Kevin heard a lot of commotion and turned around to see Officer Emmett and Phoebe Anderson walking out of a changing room. But to everyone's surprise, the two women went straight to Kevin. "I really didn't expect you guys to get here so quickly," Phoebe said while smiling at Kevin. Lily noticed Phoebe looking at Kevin and suddenly felt uncomfortable. "Kevin, I didn't expect you to be here either," Officer Emmett said as she stood there with her hands on her hips. "Why didn't you tell us? We could have ridden together." "Oh, I don't know about that. Remember what happened the last time we took a drive together," Kevin replied. Officer Emmett knew he was talking about chasing the bank robbers in his sports car. Lily wasn't sure what to think when she heard them talking like this. In fact, everyone was surprised to hear them teasing each other and acting like old friends. How did this freeloader have such a close relationship with these two beautiful women? Blair walked up to Officer Emmett and said very bitterly, "Kelly, you might not know, but Lily is now at the helm of the Jones family business. Kevin only came on this camping trip because of her." As he said this, Blair made sure he gave Kevin a snotty look. "What are you talking about? Do you have to make things so awkward?" Officer Emmett said in an irritated tone. In her eyes, Kevin was a brave and fearless hero. He was way stronger than any of these useless rich posers. "Kelly, why are you still standing up for him? You're my fiancé," Blair said anxiously. "I'm just being honest. Also, if you keep acting like this, you may not call me that much longer," Officer Emmett said as she gave him a cold stare. Blair immediately dropped his tough guy act. Okay, Kelly, whatever you say." But he still gave Kevin another dirty look. His father, Neil Blair, suddenly stood up and interrupted them, saying, "Thank you all very much for coming on this camping trip. I'll be brief. Have a good time and be careful." Then he added, "This is a great place to get in touch with the outdoors. You can fish down by the river, and there's small game out in the woods. It will be up to you to find your food over the next few days. We'll provide drinks and snacks. Just grab whatever you need and enjoy yourselves." As Neil Blair finished talking, everyone smiled. They were all from wealthy families and they already knew how to eat, drink, and have fun. They immediately broke up into cliques. Some picked up fishing rods to go fishing by the river. Others got ready to head into the woods to hunt for small game. And there were a few who had started drinking and hanging out. After all, the main goal of this outing was to make friends and get to know each other. Phoebe suddenly asked, "Kevin, are we hunting or fishing?" "This is the best part of the fall hunting season. There should be a lot of small game in the woods," Kevin said as he went over to the table and picked up a sharp hunting knife. But why don't we go fishing? The fish must be nice and plump, Officer Emmett asked. We'd do better at a lake. The current's too fast down by the river. The fish would be swept away before they had any chance to bite. And it's illegal to fish with a net around here. Of course, we could all afford the fine, but it just wouldn't be sportsmanlike, Kevin replied plainly. So what you're saying is none of those guys will be able to catch a fish, Blair said mockingly. If Officer Emmett hadn't been there, Blair definitely wouldn't have been hanging out with Kevin. I didn't say absolutely, Kevin explained. Then why are you so serious? Are you just bragging? Blair scoffed. Kevin ignored him. He turned around and said to Lily, "Let's head into the woods and see if we can catch a wild rabbit." Lily nodded in agreement. She didn't want to stay here and feel everyone's eyes on her. "Let's go," Phoebe said as she smiled and picked up a wicker basket. Then Blair stood up and announced to everyone, "Why don't we have a competition and see who catches the most fish or game?" Someone in the crowd agreed. "So what's the reward?" "Good idea. Each family will put $10 million in the pot. Winner takes all," Blair said casually. This caused an uproar. A lot of them wanted to participate, but $10 million was a lot of money. How many of them could bet that much just for fun? Blair sneered at Kevin and Lily. His goal was clear. He was goading them to play his game. Blair had already sent some of his people ahead to set things up. The Jones family was guaranteed to lose, and he'd put Kevin in his place. "Jason, will the Jones family participate?" Blair asked with a sneer. Lily wasn't pleased to hear this. She was the leader of the Jones family now, and this game involved a huge amount of money. Why did Blair ask Jason instead of her? "We'll think about it," Jason replied, but he didn't agree immediately. "What? Can't you make a decision by yourself? It's just $10 million. Don't tell me your family's so poor that you can't scrape that much together. Or are you as useless as the guy who married into your family?" Blair sneered. Kevin frowned and thought to himself, "What's with this guy? Why does everything have to do with me? It's not like I did anything to him." Kevin could tell that Blair was purposely provoking Jason. As expected, Jason took the bait and said, "Don't worry, we can still afford $10 million. Then Jason turned to Lily and said, "Since Mr. Blair has kindly invited us, should we join the game?" Blair frowned when he heard the Joneses start talking with each other about Jason's response. They all knew that the decision was up to Lily. While they didn't want to back down, they also knew $10 million was a lot of money. Jason wasn't happy about this either. He thought of himself as the family representative, but as long as Lily held most of the shares in the company, he was no longer in the limelight. On the other hand, if Lily went along with the wager and lost, Grandma Jones might force her to hand over her shares. "All right, we're in," Lily replied as she gritted her teeth. "You're braver than I thought," Blair said with a cocky smile. But Lily wasn't sure this was really a good decision. Lily and Kevin were about to go hunting in the woods when Sherwin Blair suggested that all the families play a high-stakes game. Every family would chip in $10 million. Whoever caught the most fish or game would win the pot. Lily finally agreed to let the Jones family participate. Soon the teams were decided. They were Kevin and Lily from the Jones family, Phoebe and her brother Blake representing the Andersons, Sherwin Blair and Officer Emmett from the Blair family, and then there were 6 other families too. "I'm not much into hunting or fishing, so I'll be the judge," Neil Blair said as he looked at his watch. "It's 9 a.m. and you all have 3 hours to catch as many fish or small game as you can. Be back here by noon. Good luck to all of you." Seeing that everyone else had already started to move, Lily immediately pulled on Kevin's sleeve and urged him, "Let's head up that way, into the woods." "Don't panic," Kevin said very calmly. "We just bet $10 million. What if we lose?" Lily said nervously. "We can't lose," Kevin said as his eyes swept across the forest not far away. "This is a good place to wait. If we go running recklessly into the woods, we won't catch anything. Let the other teams head in there first." Phoebe walked over with Blake and agreed. "What Kevin said makes sense. We can head into the woods a little later." She didn't know why, but when she saw Kevin and Lily together, she felt extremely uncomfortable. "It wouldn't hurt for us to wait a few minutes before going in there," Officer Emmett commented. Lily opened her mouth to speak but didn't say anything. She wasn't sure what to do. While they were waiting there, Blair sent a message to one of his relatives, who was secretly entering the woods from the other side. When Kevin and the others finally started to head into the woods, they saw some members of the Steele family picking wild berries. After about an hour, Kevin and the others had only caught a single wild rabbit, which they put in Lily's hunting basket. Suddenly, they all heard a rustling sound coming from the nearby bushes. "Did you hear that?" Blake asked with a worried look on his face. "What's that sound?" Officer Emmett asked as she gazed cautiously around their surroundings. As soon as she finished speaking, a large, ferocious cougar jumped out of the bushes and growled at them. Kevin was the first to react. "Run!" he shouted as he grabbed Lily and Phoebe's hand and pulled them in the opposite direction. "How can there be a cougar here?" Officer Emmett said with a shocked look on her face. "Let's not worry about that for now. Let's just get out of here," Kevin shouted. Their priority was to get to safety. They could answer her question later. Just then, Blair suddenly stopped and pulled a hunting knife out of his jacket. He shouted loudly, "You damn beast! Get the hell out of here!" "Sherwin!" Officer Emmett exclaimed. When everyone turned around, Blair was already standing face to face with the cougar. He waved his knife from side to side and slashed at the animal. The cougar yelped before it turned around and ran off into the woods. Kevin knew something wasn't right. He clearly noticed that the cougar was running on its hind legs. "I'm certain that was a man disguised as a cougar," Kevin thought to himself. By then, Blair had returned and was standing in front of Officer Emmett saying proudly, "Kelly, don't be afraid. As long as I'm here, nothing can hurt you, not even a cougar." Officer Emmett melted when she heard this. She thought to herself, "I never realized Sherwin was so brave. Maybe I've been wrong about him." Lily turned around and looked at Kevin. How could Blair have been so brave standing up against a cougar while Kevin just wanted to run away? This was very upsetting for her. "Lily, what's wrong? Are you still frightened?" Kevin asked with concern. He could tell that Lily was worried about something. "It's nothing," Lily sighed softly. "Since there's a cougar running around in these woods, we really ought to head back to the camp where it's safer. We should also tell the others about it so they don't get hurt," Blake said cautiously. He was still a little afraid. "What is there to be afraid of? It's just a cougar. If it dares to come back, I'll kill it and we'll cook it on the spit for dinner," Blair said arrogantly. He figured that once they got back to camp, the news of him chasing away the cougar would immediately spread. They were all sure to see him differently now. Phoebe's face suddenly turned pale with fear. She raised her trembling hand and pointed behind them, saying, "Here comes another one." Everyone turned around and looked. They were almost scared to death. This cougar looked like it was almost twice the size of the first one, and it was less than 100 feet away from them. "Run!" Blake yelled as he turned around and started sprinting for the camp. "What's going on? I only have one guy dressed up like a cougar," Blair thought to himself. "Ouch!" Phoebe yelled as she suddenly fell to the ground. "What happened? Get up!" Kevin was worried this time because he was sure that this cougar was real. "I think I sprained my ankle," Phoebe said as she winced in pain. "Phoebe, we have to get out of here," Lily said in a panic. "Lily, run!" Kevin shouted as he picked Phoebe up and put her on his back. Just then Blair shouted again, "Come on, you filthy beast!" Suddenly he heard a voice shouting in the distance, "Sherwin, it's a real cougar! Run!" Hearing this, Sherwin Blair's face turned pale. He threw down his knife and sprinted out of the woods. As they all started to run, the cougar was triggered to see them as prey and started chasing after them. "Blair, I thought you weren't afraid," Officer Emmett asked as she was running toward the camp. "That's a real freaking cougar," Blair shouted. As he was running desperately to get away, he fell to the ground, but he didn't care about his injuries. He immediately got up from the ground and kept running through the brush. Blair ran for his life without showing any concern for his fiancée. Officer Emmett felt very helpless. Although she was a highly trained law enforcement officer with years of martial arts practice, she was completely freaked out by a wild cougar. "Kevin, just leave me behind and save yourself," Phoebe said in despair. "Bullshit. We all came in here together and we're all going to leave together. Do you think I'm going to let you face a wild animal alone?" Kevin said firmly. When Phoebe heard him say this, her eyes welled up with tears and she tightly hugged Kevin's shoulder. She had already decided that if she ever survived this catastrophe, she didn't care if Kevin was married or not. She had to be with this man, even though everyone in the Jones family said he was worthless trash. She was even willing to fight Louis for him. Phoebe didn't really care what anyone thought. Suddenly, Kevin stopped. He put Phoebe down and turned around to look at the fierce cougar that was running towards them. "Keep heading for the camp. It's that way," he shouted as he pointed through the trees. "Kevin, no!" Phoebe shouted anxiously. "Go as fast as you can. I'll keep him here," Kevin yelled as he ran at the cougar without looking back. He picked up the knife that Blair had tossed on the ground and threw it at the cougar. "Come on!" Kevin growled loudly. He pulled out his own hunting knife and slashed at the ferocious animal. Kevin looked like he was ready to take on 10 cougars at once. This was the last image Phoebe had of him as she limped as fast as she could toward the camp. The knife didn't hurt the beast, so Kevin picked up a rock and smashed it on the head. The cougar immediately let out what sounded more like a shriek than a roar. Without thinking about his own safety, Kevin ran towards the dense forest, away from the camp. The angry cougar quickly followed behind. Just as they reached a clearing, Kevin dropped to the ground and the cougar ran past him, smashing into a tree. Kevin immediately jumped up and leapt back into the dense forest. When Phoebe finally limped into the camp, Blake saw her and ran over to help her. "Phoebe, where's Kevin?" Lily asked anxiously when she realized that Kevin wasn't with her. Kevin, in order to save me, he lured the cougar away in the other direction," Phoebe said sadly. They all heard a wailing sound that echoed from one end of the woods to the other. "That sounds like the cougar got him," they all thought. Some of the Joneses were happy to finally be rid of him. At least Phoebe had made it back. They had no sympathy for Kevin at all. No, Kevin can't die," Lily sobbed as she kept shaking her head no, unable to hold back her tears. "Kevin," Officer Emmett's eyes were starting to tear up too. Was Kevin still alive? After Blair tried to scare everyone with someone dressed in a fairly convincing cougar costume, so he could chase it away and look like a hero, a real one showed up. Kevin risked himself to lure it in another direction so everybody could get back safely to the campsite. "Which one of you is willing to follow me back into the woods to find Kevin?" Lily shouted desperately. But nobody replied. Lily sat down on the ground and started to cry loudly. It looked hopeless. Just then they heard several more shrieks coming from the mountain, but it didn't sound like it was just the cougar. Half an hour later, Officer Emmett helps Lily get up from the ground. I'll go with you into the woods. Even if it's too late for Kevin, we can't leave him behind." "Kelly, are you kidding?" Blair said to her. "There are cougars out there." He reached out to try to stop her. "I'm a police officer. Kevin just did what I should have done," she replied sternly. "Now get out of my way." "Kelly," Blair said angrily. He couldn't believe that Officer Emmett would take such a big risk for such a useless person. "I'll go too," Phoebe said as she walked up to Lily. She was still a little unstable because of her ankle, but her brother Blake was helping to support her. "Kevin got into this because he was trying to save me." "Phoebe, no," Blake said with a worried frown. "Blake, Dad taught us to not let our friends down," Phoebe said stubbornly. "Okay, I'll go with you too," Blake said resolutely as he gritted his teeth. What he didn't know was that at that very moment Kevin was standing over a dead timber rattlesnake. "You sneaky bastard," Kevin said angrily. He looked pretty miserable. Half of his body was covered in blood. While he was fighting with the cougar, it had clawed him a couple of times. Then, after he'd chased the cougar away, he sat on the ground to catch his breath. That's when a timber rattlesnake suddenly appeared by his feet. Normally, he would have just walked away since they don't usually bother with humans, but it had probably been riled by his fight with the cougar and felt threatened. Even though he was pretty exhausted, Kevin was still quick enough, thanks to the herbal medicine in his system, to grab the snake before it was able to sink its teeth into him. He cracked its spine just below the head like it was a chicken. About 10 minutes later, Lily, Officer Emmett, and Phoebe finally convinced more than a dozen people to go into the woods to look for Kevin. Their jaws dropped when they saw him walking towards them holding a 6-foot-long timber rattlesnake. "I've got something for your hunting basket, Lily," Kevin said with a weary smile. Lily shouted happily and was the first to run towards Kevin. She hugged him tightly. Half an hour earlier, Lily really thought that she'd lost Kevin forever. Even though her family thought he was useless, he'd always been very good to her. It was only now that Lily understood that somehow Kevin had become so important to her and she had fallen in love with him. "Don't worry, Lily. I'm okay." Kevin tried his best to comfort her. "If you keep crying, your makeup will start to run." But Lily acted like she couldn't hear him. She buried her head in Kevin's chest and cried her eyes out. "Give me a hand, guys," Kevin said with a smile. None of them could believe what they were seeing. Was this the guy Jason had told everyone was such a loser? More than 100 people stared at Kevin in disbelief. "Now, Lily, if you keep crying, I'm going to start crying too," Kevin said gently as he tried to comfort her. Who's crying?" Lily said as she stepped back and wiped the tears from her face. "Kevin!" Officer Emmett and Phoebe shouted in unison as they walked over to him. Are you all right?" Phoebe asked very nervously. "Look at me. Do I look all right?" Kevin asked as he opened his arms wide to show his bloody shredded shirt. "Between that cougar and this snake, I almost didn't make it back here." Right then, a man walked up to Kevin and patted his shoulder. "Amazing! You fought with a cougar and then killed a rattlesnake with your bare hands." Then the man suddenly turned around and faced the crowd. "Someone said that you're just trash. Nonsense." He said this in a very loud voice as if he didn't care if he offended anyone. To Kevin's surprise, Blair, Jason, and the others didn't say a word. They just stood there in shocked silence. My name is Dalton Steele. I could certainly use a friend like you," he said. Then he held out his hand to Kevin. "My name's Kevin," he replied as they shook hands. After all the ridicule he'd put up with from the Jones family and their friends, it was nice to have someone treat him like he deserved. A lot of them were jealous to see Dalton being so friendly to Kevin. But what Kevin didn't know was that Dalton was the only heir to the Steele family business. His grandfather, Norman Steele, had arrived in Chicago 50 years before and grown his business from the ground up with all his hard work. Up until now, the Steele family's holdings included some legitimate businesses and lots of entertainment facilities. They also had a strong reputation in the Chicago underworld. Nowadays, Norman Steele no longer cared much about the family's business, so he transferred all of his authority to Dalton. Even Drake and Dominic Archer respected the man. "I'm really lucky to have made friends with Dalton," Blair muttered to himself. Nobody was a good enough cook to prepare dinner, so the Blair family had arranged for a professional chef to come to the campsite. Then Butler had a couple more chefs take the rattlesnake that Kevin had caught to cook it for everyone to taste. Soon everyone broke into groups and started chatting with each other, but they didn't dare go back into the woods. Dalton found a place to treat Kevin's wounds. After talking for just a short time, they seemed to feel an instant connection. "Kevin, what do you think of this piece of land?" Dalton suddenly asked him. "Are you interested in real estate?" Kevin said with a smile. "Not really, I just like this property. It's a great place to get in touch with nature. It would be a shame to develop it and put up mansions," Dalton said with some regret. "I agree. You could put up a nature preserve here," Kevin replied as his eyes swept across the clearing in the forest. Such a large forest, it would be a pity to cut it down for development. Dalton's wife, Miranda, interrupted them to say that she wanted to take a walk along the river. "Kevin, I'm gonna take a stroll with my wife. Let's chat some more when I get back," Dalton said as he put his arm around his wife's shoulder and walked off. "Okay," Kevin agreed with a smile. Miranda also gave Kevin a friendly nod as she turned around and left. She was wearing a simple white top and a green dragon tattoo was faintly visible on her back. She walked with an air of confidence. None of the men dared to look at Miranda Steele as she walked to the river with her husband. They didn't have the guts to risk getting Dalton mad. Officer Emmett and Phoebe followed Lily to Kevin's side. "Kevin, please tell us, how did you drive that ferocious cougar away?" Phoebe asked curiously. "And how did you kill that timber rattlesnake? It was humongous." Lily and Officer Emmett were also very curious to know. They knew that no ordinary person could do what he did. And no one there knew Kevin better than Officer Emmett. She knew that he'd gotten a lot stronger and more focused thanks to the herbal medicine he'd been experimenting with, but it still couldn't have been easy to fight both of those wild animals one after the other. "I was just lucky," Kevin said modestly. "After that cougar chased me into the forest, the rattlesnake came out of nowhere. The two of them started fighting and I just picked up the scraps." Some people overheard this and decided Kevin wasn't that heroic after all. They went back to mocking him and laughing out loud. Blair glared at Kevin. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly heard a cry of surprise. "Everyone, come and look! Something just happened." As soon as he finished speaking, Kevin saw Dalton running towards them carrying Miranda in his arms. "Is there a doctor here?" he asked anxiously. "Hurry up and get over here." Miranda was lifeless and kept spitting up saliva. She was having trouble breathing and her body was trembling. "What the hell is going on?" Dalton asked. A group formed around them trying to figure out what was happening. Just then a man stepped out of the crowd and knelt down next to Dalton. He introduced himself. "Hello, Mr. Steele. My name is Ivan Daniels. I graduated from medical school." "I don't need your life story. Hurry up!" Dalton interrupted him. "Can you help her? What's going on?" Hearing this, Ivan's expression immediately showed his irritation. He would never dare to provoke Dalton Steele. On top of that, he wanted to curry favor with the Steele family, so he just smiled and continued checking Miranda's vitals. Finally, Ivan shook his head. "Mr. Steele, your wife's condition is very serious. I don't think she has more than an hour to live." "Bullshit! If you don't know what you're doing, then get the hell out of here," Dalton shouted at the young doctor. "But Mr. Steele, I'm telling you the truth. There is nothing I can do," Ivan reluctantly told him. Dalton looked over at Blair and asked him, "What the hell are you guys going to do? Didn't you make arrangements for an ambulance?" Sherwin Blair broke out in a cold sweat. "Mr. Steele, don't be upset. I'll call for an ambulance right away," he stammered. Blair was usually very arrogant and he always had a nasty look on his face, but in front of someone as important as Dalton Steele, he could kiss butt as well as anyone. Kevin suddenly squeezed through the crowd. "Don't waste your time. This place is too far away from the nearest hospital. She'd be gone before an ambulance even got here." "Kevin, what do you mean by that? Can you save my wife?" Dalton said hopefully. Before Kevin could say anything, Lily grabbed him by the arm and quickly pulled him back. "Mr. Steele, please don't misunderstand. Kevin doesn't have any medical training," Lily said in a panic. She was worried that Dalton would ask Kevin to save his wife. Lily had been married to Kevin for 3 years and she still didn't know him that well, but she knew that she had never seen Kevin treat anyone. More importantly, Miranda was Dalton's wife. They couldn't risk ticking off the Steele family. "Dalton, don't worry," Kevin started to say, but Lily interrupted him. "Kevin, don't be silly." Lily was getting angry with her husband. "Don't worry, Lily. I know what I'm doing," Kevin said as he calmly patted her hand. Then Kevin walked over to the man and asked him, "Dalton, tell me, did Miranda eat anything in the woods?" Kevin had clearly noticed something yellow around Miranda's mouth. "Did she eat something?" Dalton asked. "Let me think." He scratched the back of his head while he tried to remember. Then he said, "Just now, while we were walking along the river, I found a pear on a tree, so I plucked it for her." After hearing Dalton's answer, Kevin nearly laughed out loud. He had also noticed that tree. It wasn't a pear, but it was a fruit that was very important in concocting herbal medications. Kevin remembered reading about it in his herbal guides. It was very similar to what some people call the apple of death because it's so poisonous. What was surprising was that they shouldn't even be growing this far north. "I can help you, Dalton," Kevin said. Then he turned to the doctor and said, "Didn't you notice that she'd eaten something poisonous? I saw some roots growing by the woods that can help her. In the meantime, you need to wash her skin thoroughly and give her an antihistamine." Before Dalton could say anything, the bystanders started doubting Kevin and they began to warn him not to listen to Kevin. Butler and Blair were the worst of them. Now Dalton wasn't sure what to do, so he turned to Ivan Daniels and asked him, "So, does this make sense to you?" They all waited to hear what the doctor had to say. Dalton carried his wife back from the river and she was in bad shape. Dr. Daniels didn't think there was anything he could do for her, but Kevin realized she'd eaten a poisoned fruit from one of the trees. He told the doctor what he should do, but Blair and some of the others didn't believe him. Kevin remained calm in the face of Blair and Butler's clamoring. He slowly turned around and said, "Since the two of you are shouting so loudly, I suppose you have a way to save her? I'll gladly step aside and let the both of you get to work." "Are you deliberately causing trouble?" Blair said angrily. "How do we know you aren't just trying to trick us?" Butler asked rudely. "In other words, the two of you have no idea what to do," Kevin retorted. "If you don't understand, then please stay out of this." Dalton suddenly said, "Kevin's right. If any of you say another word, I'll throw you into the river." As soon as he said this, everyone became silent. Butler and Blair immediately clammed up. Neither of them wanted to test Dalton. After that, Dalton turned around and stared at Kevin. He said in a very grave tone, "Kevin, I believe you. What do you think we should do?" "Okay." Kevin nodded and gazed around the campground. "Dalton, take a couple of people over to those plants down by the river, where the ground's a little marshy. Bring back a couple of those tall plants, the ones with the large leaves. Make sure you pull up the roots, too." Then Kevin turned to the doctor and asked him, "Do you have your medical bag in the tent? Please bring it right back." He picked up Miranda and put her on a blanket on the ground. Some of the onlookers wanted to complain when they saw Kevin touching Miranda, but they were too intimidated by Dalton to say anything. After Dalton walked away to look for the plants, Lily came over to Kevin and whispered to him, "Kevin, don't press your luck. Please let go of Miranda and apologize to Dalton." "Don't worry, Lily. I know what I'm doing," Kevin reassured her. "How could you possibly know what you're doing? I know for damn sure you're not a doctor," Lily said anxiously. "My family can't afford to get on Dalton's bad side." Ivan came back with his medical supplies and Kevin helped him to clean Miranda's skin round her mouth. Then the doctor got an antihistamine ready. When Dalton came back with the plants a moment later, the doctor asked him, "Has your wife ever had a bad reaction to an antihistamine or any other medication?" Lily got very worried by all this and said to Dalton, "I'm not sure that Kevin has the training for this. You really should call the hospital right away." Lily was very frightened that if Miranda died, Dalton would blame her family for it. "I agree," the doctor said. "This treatment is highly irregular." "Please, Dalton, we all know that Kevin is faking it. You should get her to a hospital right away," Blair said nervously. "And what do you think those plants are gonna do? I wouldn't even put them in a salad," Butler scoffed. "All right, all of you shut up," Dalton said impatiently. "I know what you're all thinking. You're afraid that Kevin will kill my wife and I'll take it out on you. Don't worry. The doctor already said she couldn't make it to the hospital in time, so this is our only option right now." Then he looked at all of them and added, "We're in such a remote place. If we wait for an ambulance, it might be too late by the time they get here. So we'll just have to trust Kevin. And don't worry, I won't blame any of you." When he said this, they all heaved a sigh of relief. As long as Dalton wouldn't hold it against them, then Kevin could do whatever he wanted. Lily was stunned to hear this. Then she remembered how Phoebe had trusted Kevin in the antique shop, even though she still had doubts about her own husband. And now Dalton trusted Kevin with his own wife's life, even though he'd only known him for less than 3 hours. Lily had been married to Kevin for 3 years and still doubted him. "Maybe I really don't understand him," Lily thought to herself. Then Dalton asked Kevin, "Now what are we gonna do with these plants?" Kevin took the plant from Dalton's hands and stepped away as the doctor continued to treat Miranda. "I need to go over to the chef station to make an herbal remedy that will help her recover more quickly," Kevin said very calmly. "You know how to make herbal medicine?" Dalton said in shock. Of course, the onlookers didn't believe him either and started to mock him for claiming to have this skill. After all, he was just a freeloader in the Jones family. But Kevin just ignored them and calmly went about his work. Officer Emmett stared at Kevin in shock. She'd already taken one of Kevin's herbal meds, and so had Blair, but she didn't realize that he could make them himself. "So, Kevin, did you study herbal medicine while you were living off the Jones family for the last 3 years?" Jason said mockingly. But Kevin didn't care about what they were all saying. He started to use the cooking utensils that the chefs had set up by the main tent. After he was done, Kevin turned his head and pointed at Jason, Ivan, Butler, and Blair and said, "Take off your clothes. I need to start a fire." Even though Officer Emmett had warned Kevin not to show off his skills in front of anyone, he couldn't help but make a spectacle of himself at Jason and Blair's expense. "What did you say?" Jason asked anxiously. "Why don't you burn your own clothes?" Blair protested. The men saw that Dalton wasn't pleased with their reluctance to help. "Kevin, don't you stir up trouble again," Jason said angrily. Kevin smiled and replied, "All right, I'll just tell Dalton that you aren't interested in helping." "Okay, they're only clothes," Blair said as he gritted his teeth and took off his shirt. He was impressed that Kevin had maneuvered him into this position. Nobody wanted to disappoint someone like Dalton. After Blair took the lead, Jason and the other two also took off their shirts and pants. Some of the onlookers snickered when they saw them standing there in their boxers. "So now what do you plan to do?" Blair sneered. Kevin didn't reply. He just picked up the clothes Jason and the others had thrown on the ground and asked for a lighter. Then he set them on fire. The onlookers all mumbled to each other as they tried to figure out what Kevin was doing. "Kevin, do you even really know what you're doing?" Blair said with a sneer. Kevin looked Blair right in the eyes and said, "Just be a little patient and you might learn something." "Do you think we're 3-year-old kids who don't know anything?" Blair said with disdain. Kevin ignored Blair and kept stoking the fire. What he was concerned with was having a steady flame so he could put the roots in the fire and heat them evenly. He'd remember most of what he'd read in his guide's honorable medicine preparation. This was something he was sure of. He'd really gotten very good at this in an incredibly short time. Since he couldn't get a reaction out of Kevin, Jason turned to Phoebe and asked her rudely, "You're well educated, aren't you? Can't you see that Kevin's making a fool of himself?" Everyone turned and looked at Phoebe to see how she would react. Jason continued his rant. "Kevin, let's see how long you can keep pretending you know what you're doing. And now Phoebe and Lily will see your true colors. Then you can explain yourself to Dalton." Phoebe shrugged her shoulders and said, "All I know is that a lot of medicines have the same ingredients as natural plants." Then she continued, "But I'm not exactly sure what Kevin is doing right now." The onlookers thought that what she said had made sense. Still, some of them thought he was just putting on an act to look important. Kevin ignored their criticism and kept staring intently at the burning fire. By now, some people couldn't help glancing over at Dalton to see how he was going to respond. But his expression didn't change at all. He just sat quietly on the ground, hugging Miranda tightly. Phoebe started to get anxious for Kevin and added, "There's one thing I forgot to say. Some remedies have been passed down orally, so they can't be found in any books." Before she could finish speaking, Jason interrupted her. "Phoebe, you don't need to defend him." Just then, the roots that Kevin was holding in the fire started to crackle. He pulled them from the flame and took them back over to the chef's table, where he made shavings and placed them in a bowl with some water. They could all smell the sweet fragrance, although the only one who was going to consume the concoction was Miranda. Everyone immediately became quiet. They were so shocked that their jaws almost dropped. "So, it's ready?" one of them asked, breaking the awkward silence. Kevin put some of the mixture in a glass and handed it to Dalton. She should be able to sip some of this by now. It will help her to recover a lot more quickly than what the doctor just gave her. Thank you, Kevin, Dalton said excitedly as he headed over to his wife, who was still lying on the blanket. Dalton had been quiet until now because he didn't want to risk distracting Kevin. He still had some doubt about the remedy, and it would be awful to have it fail because he'd interrupted Kevin. Nobody could believe that Kevin had prepared something to help Miranda just from what was growing around the campsite. Lily stared at Kevin in amazement, and seeing that this might just work, she finally relaxed a little. But it still bothered her that she didn't know Kevin or trust him yet. Officer Emmett walked over to him and asked him in disbelief, "So you really know how to make herbal remedies? Then you actually made that pill that you gave me?" Kevin didn't answer her right away. He just shrugged his shoulders and walked over to see how Miranda was doing. Everyone was watching anxiously, wondering when she would show some signs that the cure was working.